the Weekly Show with David J. Maloney.
This week, David chats with guitarist and producer Steve Postell.
And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to the Weekly Show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got a really special guest. As one-fifth of the supergroup immediate family, he has spent his life in the music business. From composing soundtracks for the likes of Jumpin' at the Boneyard with producer Lawrence Kasdan, to recording sessions with John Oates, Kenny Loggins, and David Crosby, his quiet influence has been felt throughout the music industry. Now he arrives with his full-length album, Walking Through These Blues, hot off the presses, and it's getting great reviews. Here to chat about it all after the break is guitarist and producer Steve Postell. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight has been a staple of the music industry for decades now. From Broadway to off-Broadway, from commercial jingles to film composing, from rock and roll records with supergroups to his latest solo work, he's had his hand in all of it. Current member of the supergroup immediate family and hot off the backs of his most recent solo album, Walking Through These Blues, musician Steve Postell is here to chat about it all. Steve, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thank you very much.
So you grew up in New York during some of the most, I would say, magical times in history when it comes to music. What was it like growing up in New York in that period of New York?
Unparalleled. I mean, I suppose there's some other examples. Maybe if you were in Liverpool in 1962, I don't know, but it was just a playground for, if you like. It wasn't just music. It was what was on the museums, what was on the dance world, and I fortunately have parents who were very open, loved exposing us to the arts. So I saw Nureyev, and I saw Pavarotti, and I saw Duke Ellington, and I saw Segovia, and I saw the Hair when it was in a club before it was on Broadway, and movie. So it was, I think, unparalleled cultural time, and a great time to be. There was no carding. I used to go to the Fillmore East when I was 13. Nobody asked me any questions about it, which was one of the greatest places of all time to watch music. It was a very different time, and I'm so grateful that that's where I landed, in that town, in those years.
It's kind of crazy to think that in certain years in and around the city, any random New Yorker could just wander into a bar or a club and find themselves watching or listening to Al Cooper. Or did that kind of thing ever happen to you while you lived and worked there? Were there any great stories of people that you saw maybe in their early infancy of their career?
I saw all kinds of, like that. I walked into a club and Tim Hardin was playing, and there was not too many people there. I sat on the floor in front of him and watched him play. And I saw so many great people, from the old Doc Watson and Sonny Terry and Barney McGee and it's sort of an endless list. And one of the things about it was I don't remember ever not being able to get a ticket. That's the other strange thing. So I guess there weren't scalpers, but if I wanted to go see John McLaughlin, the Mahavishnu Orchestra at the Beacon, I would just buy a ticket. If I wanted to see Jaco Pastorius play, I just don't remember, oh, they're sold out, we can't go. And I think that's because there weren't really, the scalper thing there wasn't Ticketmaster. So it was all available. We could go to Poco's playing at the Beacon. No, let's go. And it wasn't like we had to get tickets too much in advance, and it wasn't like they were $300 a ticket.
So, I read you were awake and saw the original Beatles performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, like a lot of other people were. And I've got some of my own theories, but why do you think people seeing and hearing the Beatles on that stage kind of seemed to change all the music and musical culture from that point onward, right? I mean, why do you think that was the case? Was it because they were so new and different and unique, or something else entirely?
The Beatles were an anomaly because everything came together. It was a tsunami of timing. Those guys John and Paul going to school together, George Martin finding them, Epstein managing them. There was that can never happen again. There's too many circumstances happen at the same time to create historically, or this is my opinion, that the music was that was that important was usually one guy, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart. In our modern era, the only thing like that to me is the Beatles, but the Beatles was Jeff Emmerich, the engineer, was a big part of it. Just everything came together at the right time. And for someone like me who already was enamored with the guitar and wanted to play the guitar, just everything about seeing them changed my life that night. Like that was the kind of the end of my search for what I was going to do in my life. And I was only 6.
The irony is that they've borrowed from people like Bach. You know what I mean? Is when you listen to Paul talk a lot about different things, he'll mention, oh, well, it was Beethoven or Bach, or it was this, or we took this and moved it this way, or did that with it. And, but so you mentioned the guitar. What was your first guitar you ever, became enamored with, and what wound up being your first guitar?
The guitar, well, the thing, I don't know that I'd ever really seen a guitar or was very aware of it. I was 5 years old. My mother and I used to go for the walks in Central Park. And there was a guy playing the guitar sitting on it's called the Great Lawn in New York City. People hang out there at picnics and whatever. And it just got me. I didn't want to leave. I just was, what's going on here? And I kept talking about it. So they realized that it struck a nerve with me. So soon after that, they did a cool thing as they took me to see Segovia at Town Hall. And so it was interesting because to them, guitar, Segovia, which was also brilliant and led to me studying classical guitar and loving that form. But so by the time I saw the Beatles, probably 6 months after the Segovia concert, I was already begging to have a guitar. They were told my hands were too small still. I got one finally when I was 8, and the guitar I got, unfortunately it's not here in the studio, it's in my house over there, I still have on the wall. It's called, a lot of people have this guitar, it's called a Goya G10, nylon string, very cheap, but good. And that was my first guitar. And somehow that one has spent all these years traveling around with me, and it hangs on the wall.
So, because I was going to ask you if your parents had encouraged your path into music as a career, because I did know that the music bug bit you early. And I was wondering, were they always supportive, or was there ever any pushback or nudging like many of our parents do when they're worried about job prospects? Or did they just know that, this was something you had a knack or talent for and were consistently supportive?
It was almost the opposite. I mean, my mother was an artist, so that certainly helps. And at one point when I was 13, and you get to be 13, maybe you get a little lazy, and I suggested stopping guitar lessons. My mother was extremely permissive. The only thing she ever made me do was keep taking guitar lessons. She just knew that I was supposed to do that. My father's thing, he was a doctor at his own practice, and he always felt that there was something similar to having your own practice and being your own boss to being an artist. He didn't see it, so he was not an artist himself, but he bought me that guitar. He bought me my first electric guitar, which was a beautiful blue Melody Maker by Gibson. And when I got that for my 10th birthday. And he bought me my first reel-to-reel tape recorder, and then my 4-track tape recorder. So it was always support. I never had anything other than support. And I guess they didn't worry about as much then, is this going to be a profession or not a profession? And I was just so into it and so serious about it. And I started working really young. That's the other thing. I was already making a living playing and teaching guitar when I was 17, had my own apartment. So it just was kind of a given that, yeah, it's going to be okay.
So you went and trained at the Mons College of Music in New York City, but my understanding is you didn't stay there, and that the story is kind of a funny one. What happened that made you leave the school early?
So Mannes College back then, this is how long ago it was. Juilliard, which now has a beautiful classical guitar program, did not consider classical guitar a real classical instrument and did not teach it. So the options were Mannes College of Music and Manhattan College of Music. That was it. So I went to Mannes, and about 2.5 years in to my time there, I was taking everybody was real snobby about what is classical music, and at least Mannes did teach classical guitar, but now almost every school teaches harmony and other things like jazz harmony, whatever, to some extent. But they had none of that. So I had to find an outside teacher. So he was playing on Broadway at the time in Chorus Line, I remember, and he was a guy who taught. He's sort of studying the Ted Green tradition. Some people will know what that is, but it was a great tradition of learning harmony and theory and related to more contemporary jazz or contemporary styles of music. So he was teaching me that. Now I could already play. I was already at Mannes and doing recitals. And his name was Myron Weiss. And in his little apartment, his little studio on McDougal Street, he got a phone call during the lesson. And this was before phone machines. Wasn't even, forget about answering. This was before phone machines. So you had to pick up the phone or it would just ring and ring and ring. So he picked up the phone. He's having a conversation. I was just practicing my lesson, and I sort of overheard a little bit, and he said, "Hold on a second," and he looked up at me and said, "Hey, do you want to go on tour with Man of La Mancha?" I said, "What's that?" He goes, "It's a Broadway show, and you'd be perfect for it." And I said, "Yeah, sure." So out of nowhere, all of a sudden I had a national tour of Man of La Mancha, 2.5 month tour for the summer, or more, whenever it was. And for, at the time, incredible money for me at 19 years old. John Raitt was the lead, who was Bonnie Raitt's father, which I found out later. Anyway, I went to the headmaster at Mannes and I said, "I had great news." He said, "What?" I said, "I got a tour and I'd love to, so I'd like to, I'll take the 2 months off and I'll come back. And but I wanted to tell you the great news that I actually got a professional gig." And he said, "Well, you can't do that. We'll fail you." And I was like, "Well, I thought you were trying to make us into professional musicians." And he said, "You'll have an F on all your courses, and for the rest of your life, that'll be on your transcript." And I looked at him, I said, "Well, guess who the last person who's ever going to see that transcript is? You."
So as I recall, you spent years on the road with Chain of Fools and Little Blue, playing countless shows, like a show a day, maybe even. What was some of the craziest stuff you saw in those years?
Well, those were both, well, Chain of Fools turned into Little Blue, and those shows sort of were, those bands came out of a need that I realized I had and hadn't known. So when all my friends had bands in high school, I was playing classical guitar and solo coffee shop kind of stuff. So I didn't have a band. I'd never played in a band. The first band I ever played in was when I did a Broadway show. And so I created a band, an original band. We got signed, but we were playing like once a month. We'd do a show, Lone Star or Bitter End or something like that, which was fine. And we rehearsed 4 or 5. We had a rehearsal studio, $350 a week for a beautiful studio in downtown. And but I was always a little nervous. Once a month isn't enough to get your sort of feet in deep into the thing in a groove in a way. I mean, they were good shows. I have some tapes. Oh, it was good. And then I went to see Lonnie Mack. Now, most people watching this won't know who that is. Lonnie Mack was one of Stevie Ray Vaughan's sort of idols. And he was a blues man, Southern guy, sort of country blues. I'd met him when I did that brief stint with Pure Prairie. We did a show with him. And he was so the real thing. Like, he's just a guy who had been playing clubs and bars for 50 years at that point, or 40. And the band was all these bearded cowboy hat guys with their whiskey on the piano and just playing their butts off. It was so loose and fantastic. And I went to the Lone Star and I just had this revelation. I said, I'm doing jingles, I'm doing embroidery, all this stuff is great. And I play, but that's what I want to be able to do. That level of comfort and groove, and I can't really do it like that. So I said, the only way I might be able to do that is to make a cover band and go out and play all the time. And I did. I created these cover bands, which turned into cover and original ultimately. But with that, I could go play. Little Blue was playing 230 shows a year. And after 15 years of playing those bands, I had that comfort level that I saw Lonnie Mack had.
You went on to do some really interesting work around Broadway as well as film and television. But I think one of the coolest things, to me at least, in your story is the relationship that you formed with David Crosby of Crosby, Stills and Nash. You were catching him, dare I say, kind of on the opposite side of his career than many other people. And thus, I'd like to think that maybe you got to see another facet of him that other people didn't. But first, how did you first meet David, and what was that first meeting like?
My friend and current musical partner in a couple projects named Jeff Pevar, a beautiful guitar player. Jeff had gotten the gig to play with Crosby and Nash. 94 something, a long time ago. And that gig led to David, when David met his son that he didn't know he had, it was this beautiful guy named James Raymond. James and Jeff and David made a band called CPR, Crosby, Pevar, Raymond. And so Jeff was telling me about it. And they were writing songs for the first record. They were in New York. And Jeff said, hey, we need a place to write. And I had a recording studio. Can David Crosby come to your recording studio? Yes, he can. So I met him. It was I left them alone, but I met him then. And then became friends with James as well, who's still my pal. We're going doing some shows in 3 weeks. So over the years, I would cross paths. I would go see the shows. Then eventually got to know David better. And there was one festival, the guy, who was it that canceled? I think it was their headliner canceled. I can't remember who it was. And he called me like sort of desperate, like, I know you know a lot of people. We just lost the headline of the whole festival. And I said, I'll call Cross and see what. And he was like, sure, that sounds fun. So we put a band together and go. So we would there'd be a benefit. Hey, there's this cool benefit. Eventually we started writing together. We'd hang out, sometimes just have lunch. I played on a couple of the records. And so we just developed a rapport and a friendship over the years that led to ultimately when his playing hand, he had surgery on his hand and wasn't really recovering to the point where he felt he could get through whole shows. And I sort of offered, and he took me up on, I'll learn your guitar parts so you can keep touring. And we were going to do that. And we started rehearsing for it when he passed away, sadly. So it was a long friendship and different circumstances that would bring us together. saw him through a lot of different things. 70th, 75th birthday, and all kinds of interesting stuff. And the other part of your question, when he no longer was in the format that was CSN or CSNY, especially because he'd met his son James, who's also a brilliant jazz musician and composer, is some of David's first loves, which were more experimental in harmonically, musically, he started to be able to do them and express that in his solo work. So some of it sounds like Steely Dan. So in his second iteration of David Crosby, musically really adventurous and
you've said before that in some ways David Crosby's music was as complicated as Bach, and here's the other Bach Beethoven reference again in a weird way. So I wanted to ask you, why was that?
Well, it is. David was a savant in musically. In the sense that he didn't know what anything was called. If you ask him what chord, obviously it was a G chord. That's a G chord, but all those crazy tunings and chords, don't ask him what he's playing. He was very influenced early on from his brother's record collection in jazz. He loved the sound of all that, but he didn't know what was called, and so he had those sounds in his head, and he just created these sounds. So it was all incredible intuition. So if he felt that after 7 beats it was time to move, that bar was 7/4. There was no there were no rules, and consequently, and his playing, although he didn't get much credit for it, but since he taught me these intricate guitar parts, I can vouch for the fact that these were not simple guitar parts, and they were very specific. When he was teaching to me, if I played the B string before the E string, he said, no, it goes like this, and it was the E string before the B string. He knew exactly what he wanted to hear. So he was just one of those guys who self-taught, huge ears, and was reaching, I think, always for sounds that moved him, that were in his head. And consequently, a lot of the music that he came up with ended up being pretty sophisticated. As a matter of fact, when I said, I don't think, because he said to me, I'm not going to tour anymore because my hands, doesn't work. But we can keep writing and I can sing. And I went, well, why don't you let me play the guitar, and then you can keep playing. There's a lot. I said, my comment to him at the time was, I can play Bach, I can play Crosby. So, but it does take the same kind of attention to me, actually.
I was listening to When the Lights Go Out the other day, and his harmonization clearly shines through on that. It made me want to ask you, what was your favorite collaboration with David? Was it a song on your records, a song on one of his, something else completely different?
Well, I'm so honored to have him on that song, and to hear that beautiful voice. And I didn't tell him anything. I didn't tell him what to sing, where to sing. That's
just let David be David.
I think writing with him, there's a song called I Think I on one of the last record, or one of the last 2 records. That's a really beautiful song. I'm very proud that I wrote that with him on the record. There's another song called Capital, where I'm proud of that for a different reason. So James played, so he has these acoustic guitar samples, and so he would play this part, and he said that the only person I can think of that I know that could play this part is you. So can you figure it out? And because it was done on a keyboard, it was sort of impossible. I said, well, I have 2 choices. I can get close to it, or if we record in sections, I can retune the guitar 3 times, and I could play the exact notes that you're playing. So that's what we did. Because it was done on a keyboard, there were things that just weren't possible in a regular tuning. So anyway, Those are moments that I'm proud of and happy I got to do with David.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to Steve Postell for joining us. Steve is going to be back again next week to finish up our interview, so please tune back in. Stay safe, everyone.